Good evening. I'm Deborah Spake, Dean of the College of Business Administration, and it's my pleasure to serve as the moderator this evening for the panel discussion featuring alumni who were members of the Kent State ROTC in 1970. This event was organized by the College of Business Administration as part of the May 4th commemoration event schedule and timed to coincide with the university's Veterans Day activities, which began earlier today with a flag-raising, recognition ceremony, and luncheon. As a reminder to the audience, members of R.O.T.C. of 1970 were students on campus on May 4th and were in no way part of nor involved with the National Guard. Furthermore, among the topics we will cover this evening will be the remembrance of R.O.T.C. Cadet William Knox Schroeder, who was one of the 4 victims of that event. Before we begin, I ask that you take a moment to silence your phones. As we are recording this evening's panel discussion, and request that you hold any questions until the answer period at the end of the panel discussion. As I announce them, if the panelists would come forward, joining us this evening are Richard Krumel, who earned a Bachelor of Science in Telecommunications from Kent State in 1971 and went on to earn an MBA with an emphasis in government acquisition management and contracting from Fairleigh Dickinson University in 1980. Rick currently serves on the Kent State Foundation Board and served on the Board of Directors of the North Carolina Association of Personnel Services for many years in various capacities, including president. Greg Long earned a Bachelor of Business Administration in Accounting in 1971 from Kent State. Greg currently serves as the Treasurer and Chair for the Committee on Finance on the university's Foundation Board. Greg is a member of the College of Business Administration's National Advisory Board and also chairs the college's Accounting Advisory Council. Rod Myers earned a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Kent State in 1971 and an MBA in Marketing and Finance from Ohio State University. He learned and practiced leadership and management skills while serving for 2 years as a U.S. Army Medical Service Corps Executive Officer. David Rust majored in journalism at Kent State and recently retired as a senior photojournalist at CNN after 39 years there, starting at the network on the day it was launched in 1980. Over his career, Dave has covered stories in all 50 states and every continent in the world. Please join me in thanking these gentlemen for being with us this evening. Beyond the brief introduction, let's learn a little more about each panelist, starting with Rick. If you can tell us a bit about your career following your time at Kent State.
Well, good evening. Following my graduation from Kent, I was commissioned second lieutenant. Served in the Army Signal Corps for about 7.5 years, focusing primarily in fixed station telecommunications. My first assignment was the Pentagon, where I ran a television production studio. BS in broadcasting was my major, and went on to serve in Germany, and then left the service in 1979. I went on from there to work predominantly in project management positions for government service providers and manufacturing providers. And then I segued rather dramatically into the executive search business about 20 years ago and wound up retiring at the end of 2015, having owned my own executive search business, focusing primarily in industrial manufacturing. And following my retirement, I'm pretty much active with regard to the KSU Foundation Board of Directors, which I've been serving now for about 1.5 years.
Greg?
Yes, I, like the other participants, graduated in December of '71 and immediately went on active duty in January '72. And went through the Armor Officer Basic course and the Armor Maintenance course, And of course, we were winding down in Vietnam at the time, and they really didn't need us, so I came back and immediately joined a reserve unit in Worcester, which happened to be an MP company. And I stayed in that for 6 years, and 3 of it being the commander of it. Moved on to other positions in Columbus in a group, a battalion. I commanded a criminal investigation detachment for 9 years. I was a provost marshal. I was an inspector general. And I was going to retire in 1991, and then the first Desert War came along, and they kept us till 94, and I retired in 94 as the Deputy Chief of Staff for Resource Management, which happens to be the Assistant Controller for a division. So on the civilian side, while I was doing that and mostly in the reserves, I was a CPA in Worcester and opened my own accounting firm in '83, and I'm still there today doing the same thing I've done for the last 4 decades. So.
Rod.
First of all, I want to thank Dean Spade for invitation and also just being able to meet up with these guys after all these years. But first, just tell you a bit more about my background. So I grew up on a farm, Northwest Ohio, first generation going off to college. And so your question might be medical service, what was that all about? Well, one of the things I did today, since I come up from Columbus, just to see what has changed. The last time I was here for a veterans event was 6 years ago. But while I was in the R.O.T.C, I had the opportunity to learn to fly, paid courtesy of the Army R.O.T.C, or the Army. And so when I was given my choice of which branch then, once I graduated, and I chose medical service because I was thinking I would be a medevac pilot, but the war was winding down in 1971, so the pilots weren't needed, so I put in my 2 years, and then I returned to civilian life, and as Dean Spake mentioned, I got my MBA from Ohio State, and I joined, which was marketing focused. So I joined the Metropolitan Life. They had a program for MBAs, so I got involved with that company, and with the focus was on district sales management. And but I then subsequently changed companies, and I was with Columbus Life in Columbus, Ohio, and I worked in management side, and then I spent some time through the rest of my career with small and medium-sized companies, working with field development. And I'll just add a couple of more personal notes. So along with my work life, I helped raise a son and a daughter, and I've got 3 little sweet grandkids. But also my daughter, Andrea, has a special connection to the university I'm very proud of. She's assistant professor of art at the Stark campus, so I'm very proud about that. Thank you.
Yeah. David.
Okay, is my mic on? Can you hear it? Nope.
Pushed out.
Got it? There we go. Okay. I don't like admitting it to the big audience, especially with the camera in the background, but I wasn't a real good student here at Kent State University. And I didn't get in the journalism program. I wanted to get in the journalism program, but it was too hard for me to get into at the time. I ended up, I was the only person here on the panel who didn't get in the military service. I was in the basic R.O.T.C program, but I didn't go advanced. I ended up, after the shootings, my family moved back out to California, where I'm originally from, and inspired by the events that happened on May 4th, I did get that seed to want to get into the journalism program, and I got into school out in California and took every journalism class I could get my hands on then, and learned journalism there. I learned to write, I learned to take pictures, I got inspired, I did everything I could to try to get into that field. I finally got into it. I worked for newspapers. I ended up finally learning how to do a little TV. And in 1980, when Ted Turner started 24-hour television, I got a job with CNN, and I worked for them for the next 39 years. And I'm here tonight.
Okay. Each of you were in ROTC in 1970. Many were juniors or seniors. Generally, share with the audience what it was like for you as an ROTC member in those years, in that 68, 69, 70, 71 period. Greg,
Yes.
you want to start?
Well, it was a pretty benign experience, quite frankly, for me. As you can probably expect, that there were a few military hand salutes and other types of salutes that were passed on to me as I was walking to class on Tuesday and Thursdays, which was typically the days that we would have drill and ceremonies on the Commons around noon. But I can't say that I was ever in a position where spat upon or physically accosted or anything of that particular nature. But I was always conscious of the uniform and the fact that it was potentially going to be a magnet for some comments here or there. But overall, I think I was very fortunate in the sense that my experience wearing the uniform and representing the Army R.O.T.C. program was pretty benign.
I think that when I arrived in fall of '67 and mostly '68, there wasn't a lot of the confrontations like happened more in '69 and '70. I lived off campus in a fraternity house, so I was riding the Westland Main Plaza to and from school every day. And you would get some. We wore our uniforms, like Rick said, on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and you would get some comments, but they generally got worse each year for me. And I don't know, but I attract some of those people. I guess so I maybe got more harassed than Rick did. I don't know, but because I was in Pershing Rifles, I was on here very early every morning, and we were there till late at night a lot of times. And to the detriment of my studies, I might add. I would never recommend pledging Pershing Rifles as a freshman. It's not healthy for your grade point average. But because I was here all the time, if you had to show up in uniform at 6 a.m. to practice, you were here for 12 hours on that campus with that uniform. You didn't get it off the whole day. And that got to be a little old. And we, of course, after May 4th, we didn't wear uniforms on campus anymore. And so that kind of changed the environment, and a lot of things changed after that. But I did see some of it, but I never thought my life was in danger or anything. But you could tell there were a lot of people who did not like it. There's no question.
There was an event that happened on campus in '68, I think it was. President Johnson had declared in 1968 that he wasn't going to run for office. And it left an opening for his vice president, Humphrey, to run for office. And he decided in April of 1968 that he was going to run. And of all things, he declared on May 3rd, 1968, that his first stop in the presidential campaign was going to be Kent State University. And so on May 3rd, 1968, which ironically was 2 years and a day before the shootings of May 4th, 1970, he gave a speech, and it was on campus unrest. And Greg and I were ushers for that event. It was a political speech, but there wasn't much unrest on campus about it. There was a little protest. I think the Black United Students walked out on the speech, but there was a lot of unrest around the country at the time. I think in January of that year, that was the Tet Offensive, and that's when the nation was turning against the war in Vietnam. The month before the speech was given, Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. The month after the speech was when Robert Kennedy was assassinated in Los Angeles. So a lot of stuff was going on that year. But at Kent, it was kind of isolated, so there wasn't a lot happening for us on the campus here. I think for us, maybe, 69, the only other big event that I can remember was a demonstration at the Music and Speech Building. they had the SDS used to come and bother us all the time, Students for Democratic Society. They would come to our, we would march up and down in the Commons every 2 days a week, and they would come and mock us as we were, they would pretend like they were marching alongside of us, and they had at the Music and Speech Building, 2 of their members had been suspended, and so they went and they had a closed hearing at the Music and Speech Building, and the SDS people wanted to have the hearings opened. So they organized a demonstration, got about 200 people to go to those demonstrations to confront the people at the building to open up the hearings. There was an anti-demonstration to that. There might have been another 200 people in the anti-demonstration. There were some people, onlookers came to that. By the time everything was all said and done, I think the Kent Stater said there was 1,000 people around the Music and Speech Building. Those students went in there, finally made it inside the building. They confronted the police inside the building. 60 of the demonstrators were arrested on the inside for breaking and entering. 7 of the students were arrested for inciting the riot. And that was the biggest, I think that was the biggest demonstration that happened while we were here on campus before the May 4th riots. One thing that was interesting, I thought about that demonstration is later on, probably 2 months prior to the May 4th shootings, one of the students that was involved in that, that was arrested in that riot, there was a bombing in New York, and in Greenwich Village, there was members of the SDS that had become a little more, I don't know how you, the Weather Underground. They were a more hardy faction of the Weather Underground. I mean, the Weather Underground was the SDS, but on steroids, really, I guess you could say. They had a bomb-making factory in this area, and they were making bombs and allegedly to use at Fort Dix. And the people making the bombs, it crossed the wires, it blew up, and destroyed 4 of these townhomes. Well, the guy that was making the bombs was the same guy that was arrested in this Music and Speech Building at that demonstration on Kent State. So anyway.
And I'll add to all what the guys have said here as far as my experience, and echoing what Rick said about being benign. But I'll just go back to the basics, 67, the draft. That's what motivated me to join R.O.T.C, because I figured if the war was still going on, I would preferable to be serving as an officer. And with the draft, it had an impact on especially the men, that because we were all focused on GPA to stay, to keep our college deferments. So I think that really was pretty subdued, and I like Rick and everybody else, and I have a nightmare of spit shining my shoes, Tuesday and Thursday. But anyhow, because my kids, that's what they asked me, like, what was it like, Kent, and you were wearing, what, your uniform? But it did change a bit, 69, late 69 when the draft, the lottery replaced the draft, so I think there were some folks being able to be more vocal in their resistance, but still I didn't have any encounter, felt my life in danger, so, in my experience. Let me just add a little bit about Hubert Humphrey. So political science, I got involved early on. It was a really great thing. They had a mock convention in '68 on campus, and I was involved with Young Democrats, and I was campaigning for Hubert Humphrey in Akron, and met his sister. She was over making the rounds, and so that was my experience with Hubert Humphrey.
Well, I remember too, Hubert Humphrey gave us, for being the ushers at his event, gave us pins, little plastic pins, the Vice President of the United States on them, and I took mine home to save it, and my dog ate it. So,
so it'd be out on the table tonight otherwise?
It'd be out on the table tonight, but it's gone. Yeah.
That's an omen.
So one of the pivotal moments leading up to May 4th was the burning of the R.O.T.C. building on May 2nd, 1970. What was your involvement related to that event, and were any of you involved in the cleanup efforts on the following day?
Well, as my memory recollects, we were that day, I believe it was a Saturday. We, I think juniors that were preparing to go to R.O.T.C. summer camp that summer were out in a field exercise with weapons familiarization. It was a lousy night, or lousy day, I should say, weather-wise, and we spent a lot of time in the R.O.T.C. building cleaning our weapons before we were allowed to leave. And I can recall that as we left the building, there were a number of protesters that were just surrounding the building, and of course we had a few name calling and things of that nature. And then later that night, I simply heard the rumor that the building was on fire. But I was not requested, nor did I get involved in any way with either weapons accountability or cleanup the following day in the aftermath.
Well, with full disclosure, May 2nd, 1970 was my 21st birthday. So if anybody has ever been 21, my memory is failing me. Let's just say that. It was also, I lived in a fraternity house. I was treasurer of the fraternity, and we were having this Quo Vadis, which is some kind of big hado. So between the drinking and all the other stuff that we do, I don't remember a lot about May 2nd, but I do remember I got a call from the R.O.T.C. department that I was to report the next morning about 8 o'clock, if I can remember. I remember dragging myself out of bed at the fraternity house and saying, you know, this doesn't make any sense. They wanted us to get down there and assist in the cleanup because inside that building were stored all the weapons that Rick had talked about. And the FBI was there, and their big thing was they wanted to be sure that, see, fires cover up crimes, and a lot of times you'll do something and then you'll burn the building down to destroy the evidence. Well, they wanted to be sure that all the weapons were accounted for. So we showed up, and by then the National Guard had really surrounded the building, so the protesters were back. And we were there that whole day with big heavy gloves on, cleaning, pulling out of the rubble all these barrel and receiver groups for these M1s. And then we were lining them up on the ground, and then the FBI guys, they had a complete listing of the weapons, of course, and they were checking them off, and in the end, there were none stolen. That wasn't about a weapon, but you can't be sure of that unless you do it. So I spent all day that day working with the FBI, and I'm sure some other police departments, there were a lot of them around. We had no lack of police and other people. So we spent all day doing that, and that was a pretty awesome task.
In my experience, I was at the time living on campus. Actually, I lived all 4 years. The last 2 years, the dormitory no longer exists. It was part of the small group housing 2. It was Munson-Meyer. I was in, it was an international dorm, and that was a great experience for me because we had a lot of debates about the war going on. But with that said, and these guys heard them talking about their GPA average, and mine was sort of needed improvement, and I was a junior, and I was thinking about maybe law school, so I thought, I gotta get this thing up there. So I was working on a paper and this and that, and really the only thing that I heard overnight was Sunday night, the helicopters and the lights, and that was about it. But I never got a phone call, nor did I go up to the area up until Monday morning, the 4th. So, and this is days before cell phones and email. So.
I just spent minimal amount of time going through the officers' instructors' files and seeing what could be recovered out of those files.
So May 4th occurs, and in the shootings that day, one of the individuals killed was William Schroeder, who was in the R.O.T.C. What do you remember about him, and what was that day like for you?
I didn't know Bill very well. It was my understanding that he was a 4-year R.O.T.C. scholarship recipient. So the message was he was obviously very, very sharp, very smart, did not have a lot of interaction with him based on where we both fell within the cadet brigade. I was in the middle of most of the throng of people on the Commons that day, and I was encountered by a clothing appreciation professor. When you have a BS in broadcasting, it's technically fine in professional arts, and you have to know clothing appreciation, I guess, in order to graduate. And she reminded me that there was a midterm exam being held in Nixon Hall in about 10 minutes, and I should accompany her and take it. So I sat down and I began to said a little prayer, and unfortunately the answer to that prayer was a person who came running into Nixon Hall shouting at the top of their lungs, "Does anybody know first aid for gunshot wounds?" And the midterm was promptly over, and I simply returned, that we were instructed to return to our residence halls if we were on campus, and by that time I was in Tri-Towers in Wright Hall, and basically myself and a bunch of others within the hall just sat down and listened to WKSU for 3 or 4 hours, basically telling us what was going on, and then dramatically the university was announced that it was closed and that we had a few hours to vacate the property. Now, living in New Jersey at the time, that was a bit of a problem, but fortunately my roommate and his family invited me to their home in Dayton, where I spent 3 weeks before we were allowed to get back.
I like Rick. I knew of him. I did not know him. He was I believe a year behind us, so I did not know him real well, but I knew of him. And of course, I was still working there while that was all going on, and when you're kind of got a job and a mission, you just do it. And we found out what was going on because we were just behind the Commons where the burned out building was. So I was there, and you hear the gunshots. You see them coming back over the hill, back down, and then you see Glenn Frank riding around in a Jeep with a megaphone, talking and trying to get calm and get everybody calmed down. And then, of course, everybody's ordered, back to their dorms, back to wherever you came from. So everybody packed up immediately and went back to where they were. And then virtually martial law was declared in Kent over that night. So you weren't even really allowed to be out. You had to go back to where you were and stay there. And I remember going back through Kent, walking back to fraternity house, and down through Kent and across the railroad tracks, and there were sheriff's deputies about every 10 feet the whole way along the road that I remember going out. Then once we got back in the fraternity house, you had to stay there. There was a curfew, and they had helicopters going around. They had the Jeeps driving around with all the floodlights on. If they caught you out, they would arrest you for curfew violations. So, and then it was a lockdown, and then you basically had to evacuate. And then you got instructions later when you could come back and pick all your stuff up. And but it was very, very tense right after the shooting.
My recollection experience of that day, and I was a class at Bowman Hall. That's where, with my degree, political science, spent most of my life there. But there was a protest on Friday, May 1st, which is when they announced at noon on Monday the 4th they were going to have a demonstration. And so my class then was dismissed, but I then, like most of the other folks who gathered around the Commons, we were just wanting to see what was going on, curious, and that was my situation. So I got there right after the shootings that occurred, and talking about Glenn Frank, saw him frantically trying to get everyone to calm down, and it was at that point the word was spreading that the university was closing, and so I made my way back to my dorm in Munsmeyer Hall, loaded up my car, picked up my girlfriend, and went to Columbus. But I did not also Bill Schroeder, did not know him. He was a year behind. And I only found out probably a few days later, reading the newspaper, that he was one of the students shot.
Yeah, well, Bill was a question. Greg and I were in Pershing Rifles. We knew of Bill and knew who he was. He was an upstanding guy that was in the regular corps, but we kind of were isolated in Pershing Rifles, and we kind of associated with just our group, and so we didn't know him very well, but we always knew him as being a fine, upstanding guy, and that's about it. That's it.
And your experience that day?
That day, actually, I was going into Cleveland. I was going back. My car was parked. I was a commuting student, so my car was parked in a lot on the other side, and I lost my keys on the hill that day. And I knew that there was a demonstration that was called for at a certain time, and I wanted to get out of there before it happened. And I finally found my keys, got them, and got out there before the demonstration had been called. And then just as soon as I got in my car, I heard all these things on the radio, and then realized what had happened, and then just got back after the shooting had occurred.
So after that day and after you graduated, some of you served in the military, some didn't. If you did, can you tell us in what capacity? And also, how do you think the events of 1970 went on to impact your lives?
Well, I can just remember that at R.O.T.C. summer camp that summer, whenever any of the cadre found out that I went to Kent State, they were, I think they cut me a little bit of slack in terms of how they treated us that were Kent State students. You know, the cadre at Indiantown Gap Military Reservation in Pennsylvania is the summer camp location that I know Greg and I went to, and it was the first Cav had just come out of Vietnam, and so these guys were just very, very happy to be home, and they were in a good frame of mind to begin with. But when you said that you were from Kent State, they gave you a little bit more slack. I think the rest of my life has been represented by lots and lots of people coming up to me in the last 50 years with the question, what really happened? And I don't really know what the answer to that was. And I have been not remiss, but have oftentimes just told people that I didn't know exactly what happened or why it happened. And the way in which it's affected my life is, it may be off point a little bit, but when I think back 50 years, we never really had dialogue. It was me against you. Everything out of your mouth is wrong, everything out of my mouth is right. And I wonder at times, 50 years later, what have we learned as a society in 50 years? We are no more closer to consensus today than we might have been in conversations surrounding Army R.O.T.C. at Kent State 50 years ago. And I wonder if we were able to be in dialogue 50 years ago, if things might have been a little bit different. And it's my hope and my prayer that we as a country and a nation get to learn very, very quickly before it's too late what it means to be in community with each other, and that we are willing to sit down and listen to the other person with respect and with dignity, regardless of what the position might be.
Very good. When I knew that question, you have to start thinking, how has it impacted you? Well, it had various stages. One, within a year or two after it happened, if somebody found out you were there, they immediately wanted to know the details. What happened? Why did it happen? You know, you had to come up with a consistent message that you could say. You couldn't have to think about it every time somebody asked you the question. So you really had to come up, especially because I spent so much time around military people in the first 5 years after May 470. Military people tend to think differently than civilians do, and I think that there were a lot of them really didn't know much about it, and they would overreact. And so it was my job to make sure they understood what really happened there. And so over time, you kind of hone your message. And even to this day, I still go out and I end up in a lot of high schools on Veterans Day. And the minute you tell them about yourself, they don't really care what you did in the military. They want to know what happened to Kent State on May 4th. Seriously, things that they've seen movies on, like Somalia and Black Hawk Down. I go with a guy that was there and that. So that's all they want to talk about, the events that they can relate to. And so I really had to hone my message down if I'm talking to high school kids about that, to make sure they got a true representation of what happened there, and not everything they've heard or read. But they're very curious about it. It's still one of those national events that they care about.
I'll just also elaborate a little bit about my service, the 2 years medical service. So my officer's basic training was at Fort Sam Houston, San Antonio. Then my tour of duty was at Fort Jackson, South Carolina. It was the 257th Medical Detachment, which was a filled dental unit, the only filled dental unit in the Army at the time. And so I was destined just to 2 years, and then, as I mentioned to everybody, what I did afterwards. But support of the university, because what it gave me, one of the things I did right from the get-go after graduating, I had the opportunity to become a life member of the Alumni Association. It was dirt cheap back then, so that's been the best investment I ever made, was joining the Alumni Association, and but also continuing involvement with veterans. There's a group, it's a national group. I belong to a chapter in Columbus, Team Red, White, and Blue. And I'm probably one of the older members of the group, because this group, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the team, Red, White, and Blue, but it's designed to, through physical activity and social gathering, service, and to build camaraderie, and to help, especially the younger guys, people, to deal with some of the PTSD situations they have. So that's my lingering involvement. Because I was not, when I was thinking about getting involved with the veterans group, I realized I was not a American Legion guy, like my father was. And this group has really been great for me. And so that's the two things, what, as a result, my still close attachment to the university and with the veterans.
After leaving Kent, I never expected to, in the job that I am, I never expected to run across so many school shootings, and that's what I do at Kent. I mean, at my job, I think I don't know, I've been to more school shootings than I can count on both hands, and they just seem to occur again and again and again and again, and each one reminds me of the days back here in May of 1970, and they just don't seem to stop. So I don't know what we learn, but it just seems to keep coming. But I don't know what to say about it.
So, Dave, you also covered a lot of military conflicts after, even though you never served in the military.
Right. I think the training here was excellent for that. What I learned in R.O.T.C. and what I learned in Persian Rifles was a great asset to the work that I did with serving with the military, or working alongside the military. I got to work with lots of different units, and it was very helpful.
So now we're at the portion of the evening where you have an opportunity to ask the panelists questions. Do we have any questions from the audience?
Got to be some question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you so much
Well, I've been around Kent a lot since I graduated, a lot more than some people. By the way, personally, I think that like dealing with very difficult family issues, I think that this was a very difficult issue to deal with for a lot of people. So I don't think in the beginning they really knew how to deal with it. I think they wanted to show respect in an appropriate way. What's too much, what's too little. You know, you have a lot of opinions on campus from different groups. Personally, I think it needed memorialized. I think it needed to be handled very carefully. It's like losing people. It needed to be done very delicately and very much with honor. But I don't think in a community the size of Kent State that that's an easy thing to come up with a consensus quickly. I think it took time for those to heal to figure out how you wanted to do it, and I think it changed and morphed a lot over the last 50 years. That's just my opinion. I don't think it was the easiest way to figure it out, and whether we've hit the sweet spot, you know, I know when they opened up the May 4th museum and stuff, the memorial over there, I thought that was great. I went back through the stuff I had and gave everything I had to it. I thought that was appropriate, and the better they make that, the better I think it is. So I think that it was just like dealing with the death of something in a family or very difficult. I think it was hard to figure out what was right, but and I think it maybe changes over time. And that's just my opinion. I don't have an answer, but I think it should be done very tastefully, and I think they've done a lot of that.
And I think I would add to it, and this afternoon I had never been to the May 4th Center, and I just walked around. I'm sort of reminiscing that day for myself, and just the understanding from the day it happened and the victims. Most were like myself. Just by fate, I wasn't closer in or whatever. Most of the folks were like innocent bystanders. But it also, what they gave their lives in that way, but it was a turning point, history of the country, especially with the war. And a lot of people attribute then the reaction from Nixon on down, how the war, our efforts, our involvement changed. So I think it is necessary that they be recognized for the lives that they gave to evoke change in the country. So I, even though was not living in the community, or I would follow through news or alumni magazine about it, but I certainly support what has been done.
Other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
So I guess first off, thank you all for your service, both to country and community. And I guess second, everyone here is basically your guys' legacy as like Kent State R.O.T.C. But my question really is, there's some interesting parallels that I noticed throughout the forum here. Mr. Krumel, you said that the attitude is still very much like it's not you and me, it's you versus me or you against me. And the attitude on campus now, while certainly not to the degree leading up to and after the May 4th incident, is still very much like a sense of indifference or not really a sense of, gratitude towards like R.O.T.C or military for that matter. So stuff, or I guess like that attitude hasn't really changed much. But with that being said, does that give you like more like a sense of hope that it could change? And if it does, how do you think it could? Or does that sort of give you a sense of like dismay?
It's a tough question. Thank you for the question nonetheless. I'm always on the side of optimism that that things can change. I've had some discussions very recently with folks within the Army R.O.T.C. organization at Kent. So your comments about what's happening today in terms of attitude towards the Army R.O.T.C. cadets that are enrolled don't surprise me. I'm told that, in essence, what you've just indicated in your question still exists. So I think it just boils down to, in many cases, the difference that exists in people's minds who don't really necessarily understand the role of the military. 50 years ago, we were all viewed as symbols of the problem, and yet I think if you asked each of us why we were in Army ROTC at the time, we would give you all different answers. But the point of the matter is that the military right now is there to defend the Constitution of the United States, and it's not to get involved in the debate, in the political debate as to whether or not we should be in this country or that. And I think sometimes those that oppose ROTC on campus are those who feel that somehow the military of our government is, or of our nation, is somehow involved in that decision-making process. I would rather take the view that we look at how the military has served us, not only in defending our country, but also in defending others across the globe that are not in a position to defend themselves. And of course, where the military, both at the active duty level and the National Guard and Reserve level, gets involved in helping to mitigate disaster that occurs within our own country. So, not the most concise answer to a rather tough question, but those are my thoughts.
Well, the only thing I would add is, and I'm not that heavy a thinker. I just think that today, if you look at society's view of the military, it's so much better today than it was in the 60s and 70s. You see that, the guys, the poor guys coming back from Vietnam, they were just treated very poorly. And that attitude was reflected here on campus. What I see now here is a much more positive view of the service, what you guys are going to do. I see a much improved ROTC department. I get all the Facebook things of it. I'm so amazed at how great it is now compared to what we had back then. But I think it's an attitude. I like today's events on campus, when you're honoring these veterans, that stuff never happened then. They would say nothing, but they didn't do anything to honor them that I know of. It's a whole different attitude from the leadership of the college. And when you've got the president of the college that leads these things, I think it's wonderful. We never saw any of that, but that was a reflection of society back then, I think. And we weren't helped. If you wanted to go in the Army and be an ROTC, you had to be willing to take some of that grief, because you were not going to be a lot of people did not hold that out to be a great attribute. So you were doing it in spite of a lot of people. You weren't looking for a lot of personal gratification. I think now 9/11 changed a lot of that. Not that I didn't see it happening before that, but 9/11 brought this country together. And a lot of what's happened since then has been very positive, and we've treated our wounded, our veterans a lot better than what we ever did. Now, I'm not a big fan of the VA. I think they could do a lot more. I think the only thing, the one thing that I would say is, if we spend the money to send people off to fight our wars, we ought to take care of them when they get back. And I don't think we do that as well as we should. And we need a lot better system to do that. But that's just my editorial. That's the only one you'll hear out of me, but I truly believe that. The guy that really mentioned it the most is Bernie Sanders. He brought that up many times about taking care of them when they come back, and we haven't done that. But I just think the whole country's attitude is a lot better today than what it was then.
And I'll add a personal experience with an event in Columbus that we run honor flights, and most of the guys now are Vietnam era, like we all are here. And so just the expression on their face, like they're finally getting some recognition and really appreciative. Because unlike our fathers, my father was a World War II vet, and how they were treated much differently. And but they finally realize it's time to recognize that particular group. So I've seen this firsthand, and it's really great.
Yes.
I don't remember which one, but someone mentioned that after May 4th, we didn't wear uniforms on campus anymore. Were there other, did I get that correctly?
In the following year, in 1971, Army R.O.T.C. did not wear their uniforms during that year.
Were there other changes to the R.O.T.C. program?
I don't really think so, ma'am. We obviously were in a different facility in what's now Rockwell Hall. The accommodations were a lot nicer, and we had student nurses on our floor who occasionally came in and said, "We're tired of practicing hypodermic needles on oranges. Lift your sleeves up." But that's about it.
Yeah, well, it took a much lower profile after May 4th. Like Rick said, we did more uniforms on campus. When we drilled down at Dick Stadium, and they found us, they tracked us down and still protested, but we were much less visible from that point on, and it needed to be done. I mean, all it would have done was just incite the people that didn't like us in the beginning. And so I think, and we had strict instructions all along from the beginning. You didn't confront anybody, you didn't listen to them, you never reacted to anything, and I never heard of an incident where anybody in the department ever retaliated against anybody that did anything to them. And there were some ugly things done to people, nothing permanent, just nasty stuff, eggs and tomatoes and stuff like that. But nobody ever, that I ever heard of, ever turned around and ever did anything. So I consider that great restraint.
Well, I think one of the other reasons for restraint, if I'm not mistaken, is that the grand jury was meeting often into 1971 regarding the Kent State incident. And so it would make sense to me that some people were perhaps laying a little bit low. And just before the graduation in May of 71 or June 71, the results of the grand jury were released, and I guess those that escaped that body, if you will, felt a little bit more empowered to come see us. And I think our final graduation ceremony or formation out at Dick's was one where we were met by a little bit more active resistance.
So that concludes this evening's panel. If you'll join me in thanking the panelists for being here. If you do have other questions, we do have a reception following in this building in room 204 if you'd like to join us. Thank you.